In the unforgiving dust of 1880s, Arizona, a woman's worth was often measured by her beauty or her dowry. Agnes Purnell had neither. Marked by a cruel twist of fate and a birthmark that stained her cheek like spilled wine, she was deemed the ugliest bride in the territory. Her own stepfather, a man rotted by whiskey and greed, sold her in the middle of Redemption's Bluff for less than the price of a lame horse. The cost for her life, her future, her very soul. A single pair of well-oiled leather boots. The buyer was Silas Kane, a giant of a man with a reputation as cold and hard as the winter ground. But what this silent cowboy and a mysterious Navajo elder saw in her would ignite a saga of revenge, redemption, and a love no one could have ever predicted. The sun over Redemption's Bluff was a merciless hammer beating down on the parched earth until the dust itself seemed to sweat. For Agnes Purnell, the heat was a familiar torment, no different from the scornful stares that followed her every limping step. She was 20 years old, though the hardship etched on her face made her look closer to 40. Her world was a cramped, shadowed space defined by the four walls of her stepfather's shack and the cruel, unyielding judgment of the townsfolk. The source of their scorn was the deep crimson birthmark that spread across her left cheek and down her neck, a splash of color so vivid it looked like a fresh wound. It was the first thing people saw, the only thing they remembered. That, and the slight dragging limp in her right leg, a remnant of a fever that nearly claimed her as a child. The marked mule, the children called her. The adults were quieter but infinitely crueler, their whispers slithering through the general store and the saloon like desert rattlers. Her stepfather, Jedediah Stokes, was a man carved from rot-gut whiskey and resentment. He'd married her mother for a small plot of land that proved stubbornly barren, and when Martha Purnell succumbed to consumption, he was left with what he considered her final useless burden, Agnes. He saw her not as a daughter, but as a blemish on his already miserable existence, a constant limping reminder of his bad luck. The day it happened began like any other. Jedediah was drunk before the sun had fully risen, his voice a gravelly roar. "Get yourself cleaned up, girl. You're earning your keep today." Agnes, her hands raw from lye soap, didn't dare ask what he meant. She washed her face, the cool water doing nothing to dull the fiery red of her mark. She put on her only decent dress, a faded calico garment patched in a dozen places, and pulled her mousy brown hair back into a tight, severe bun. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach. Jedediah shoved her out the door and prodded her toward the center of town, where a small crowd was gathering near the livery. It wasn't market day. Something was wrong. Sheriff Brody watched from the shade of his office, his face a mask of weary disapproval, but he made no move to intervene. This was Jedediah's business. This was family. Stokes climbed onto a wooden crate, pulling a struggling Agnes up beside him. The crowd murmured, their curiosity piqued. Folks of Redemption's Bluff, Jedediah bellowed his breath a foul cloud of stale whiskey. "I'm a man of simple means, a poor widower saddled with a burden no man should have to bear." He gestured down at Agnes, who stared at her worn-out shoes, willing the ground to swallow her whole. "She ain't a beauty, I'll grant you that. She's a clumsy ox, can't cook a lick without burning it, and her face is enough to curdle milk." A few cruel chuckles rippled through the crowd. Agnes felt each one like a physical blow. "But she's strong-backed," Jedediah continued his sales pitch, growing desperate. "She can scrub and haul, useless to me, but maybe one of you lonely prospectors or ranchers needs a hand. A wife of a sort. I ain't asking for much. A bottle of your finest bourbon, a new saddle, What am I bid for the girl? Silence. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the town square. Even the most hardened souls seemed stunned by the raw, pathetic cruelty of the display. Agnes squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. This was it. The ultimate humiliation. She was no longer a person, just chattel to be bartered. From the back of the crowd, a voice, low and resonant as distant thunder, spoke a single word. Boots. Heads turned. Pushing his way through the stunned onlookers was Silas Kane. The man was a legend in the territory, and not a comforting one. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a barn door. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and sun-weathered skin, dominated by a thick, dark beard, and eyes so pale a blue they looked like chips of ice. He was a man of the high, lonely places, a rancher who kept to himself on a spread that bordered Navajo lands, a place most folks considered haunted or cursed. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke to no one, his presence alone, enough to silence the saloon. Jedediah squinted. What was that? Silas Kane took another step forward, his gaze fixed not on Jedediah but on Agnes. For the first time, someone was looking at her, truly looking, and not flinching away. He seemed to look past the birthmark, past the limp, into the terrified core of her. "I'll give you my boots for her," Silas repeated. His voice was calm, steady, devoid of any emotion. He pointed with a thumb to a pair of brand-new, hand-tooled leather riding boots hanging in the window of the mercantile. They were a work of art, rich, dark leather, intricate stitching with polished silver spurs. They were worth more than Jedediah Stokes would make in a year of back-breaking labor he never intended to do. Jedediah's greedy eyes lit up. He licked his lips, the humiliation he was inflicting on his stepdaughter, forgotten in the face of such a prize. Those boots for her. Silas gave a single curt nod. The deal was struck. The store owner, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, was summoned. Silas paid for the boots in gold coin without a word, and Henderson handed the prize to a trembling, ecstatic Jedediah. "She's all yours," Kane Stokes slurred, giving Agnes a rough shove forward. She stumbled, her bad leg giving way, and would have fallen if not for a surprisingly steady hand that caught her arm. It was Silas. His grip was firm but not painful. He pulled her upright, his touch sending a jolt of sheer terror through her. She was now the property of this silent, intimidating giant. Her fate had been sealed for a pair of boots. As Silas Kane led her toward his waiting horse, a massive black stallion that seemed as formidable as its owner, the crowd parted before them. The whispers had returned now, laced with a new kind of venom pity mixed with morbid fascination. She risked one last glance back at Jedediah. He was already sitting on the crate, pulling on his new boots, a grotesque look of triumph on his face. He didn't even look at her. He had his prize, and Silas Kane had his. The journey to Silas Kane's homestead was a masterclass in silence. He lifted Agnes onto the back of the black stallion, placing her in front of him, with an ease that betrayed his immense strength. She felt small and fragile, wedged between his powerful form and the horse's muscular neck. His chest was a wall of solid muscle at her back, and she could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his heart, a stark contrast to the frantic bird trapped in her own ribs. They rode out of Redemption's Bluff without a word. The sun climbed higher, and the landscape shifted from the dusty, trampled ground of the town to the raw, untamed wilderness of the Arizona Territory. Towering saguaros stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to the unforgiving sky. The terrain grew rougher, the trail dwindling to a narrow path, winding through rocky canyons and across dry, sun-baked mesas. Agnes had never been this far from town. Her world had been one of fences and walls, both literal and emotional. Out here, the sheer scale of the land was overwhelming. It was beautiful in a stark, brutal way that frightened her. It felt like a place where a person could disappear and never be found. Hours passed. The silence stretched thin and taut until it was more deafening than any shout. Agnes's mind raced, concocting 1,000 horrifying scenarios. Was he a madman? A hermit who desired a slave to do his bidding until he tired of her? The tales told about Silas Kane in hushed tones around the town's pot-bellied stoves flooded her memory. They said he'd killed a man in a card game, that he'd wrestled a mountain lion with his bare hands, that he didn't speak because the devil had claimed his tongue. She dared not move her body rigid with fear. Every so often, Silas would shift his weight, and his arm resting lightly on the saddle horn would brush against her. The contact was electric, terrifying. Yet his touch was never cruel. His hands, when he'd lifted her, were calloused and huge, but his grip had been measured almost gentle. It was a confusing contradiction. As dusk began to bleed, purple and orange across the horizon, they finally arrived. The homestead was nestled in a small, sheltered valley, flanked by a sheer rock face on one side and a sparse pine forest on the other. It was the most isolated place Agnes had ever seen. A small, sturdy-looking cabin stood in the center, built of dark, thick logs, with a stone chimney trickling a thin ribbon of smoke into the evening air. A corral held 2 other horses, and a small, well-tended vegetable patch was fenced off nearby. It was a place of solitude, not squalor. Silas swung down from the stallion in one fluid motion. He then turned and without a word reached up for her. Agnes hesitated, her muscles screaming in protest from the long ride. He simply waited his patience, as vast and unnerving as the landscape around them. Awkwardly, she slid down her legs, trembling as they touched the ground. Her bad leg buckled immediately. She braced for the fall for the hard, unforgiving earth. But it never came. Silas caught her, his hands circling her waist, holding her upright as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her there for a moment longer than was necessary, his icy blue eyes searching her face in the fading light. She flinched, expecting a look of disgust at her birthmark, but his expression was unreadable like a weathered rock. He released her and gestured toward the cabin. Inside. It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her since they'd left town. His voice was even deeper than she remembered, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. The cabin's interior was as sparse and severe as its owner. It was a single room dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed neatly made with a thick wool blanket was tucked into one corner. In the other was a small cot. Everything was meticulously clean and organized. There was no clutter, no personal trinkets, only the bare essentials of a solitary life. Silas moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the embers. He motioned for her to sit at the table. Agnes obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair, her hands clenched in her lap. He ladled stew from a pot hanging over the fire into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one in front of her, along with a piece of dark, heavy bread. They ate in the same profound silence that had defined their journey. The stew was simple venison and root vegetables, but it was hot and nourishing. Agnes was so hungry, she devoured it quickly, trying not to make a sound. She was acutely aware of him sitting across from her, the scrape of his spoon against the bowl, the only noise in the room. When they finished, he took her bowl, washed it in a basin, and set it to dry. He then walked to the main bed, pulled the thick blanket off, and carried it over to the small cot. He laid it out carefully. "This is yours," he said, his back to her. He then turned, and his gaze met hers. For a fleeting second, Agnes thought she saw something in those pale eyes. Not pity, not desire, but a deep, cavernous sorrow. Then it was gone, replaced by the same impenetrable stoicism. He gestured to the cot. "Rest. Work begins at dawn." Without another word, Silas Kane moved to the main bed, removed only his boots, and lay down on top of the thin mattress facing the wall. Within minutes, the sound of his slow, deep breathing filled the cabin. Agnes sat frozen on the chair for a long time, the firelight flickering across the room. She was a captive, sold for footwear, miles from anyone or anything she knew. She was at the mercy of a silent giant, a man who was a complete and terrifying mystery. Yet he had not harmed her. He had caught her when she fell. He had fed her. He had given her the only blanket. Exhausted beyond measure, she finally moved to the cot. It was hard, but after a lifetime of sleeping on a lumpy straw pallet, it felt almost comfortable. She wrapped herself in the heavy wool blanket. It smelled faintly of pine smoke leather and something else, something uniquely him. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Agnes Purnell couldn't decide if her new life was a prison sentence or a strange, incomprehensible rescue. Life with Silas Kane settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. It was a life of hard work and profound silence. He rose before dawn, and the sound of him stoking the fire was her alarm clock. He would leave a pot of coffee and a piece of bread on the table for her, before heading out to tend to his horses and the small herd of cattle that grazed in the high pastures. Her duties were unspoken, but clear maintain. The cabin, tend the vegetable garden, wash their meager collection of clothes, and have a hot meal ready when he returned at dusk. At first, Agnes moved with the timid, skittish energy of a cornered animal. She expected a harsh word, or a blow for every mistake, a burnt piece of bread, a misplaced tool. But the blows never came. Silas's reaction to her errors was a quiet, unnerving patience. If the stew was scorched, he ate it without complaint. If she dropped a plate, he simply swept up the pieces. His silence was a wall she could not penetrate. He never asked about her past, never spoke of his own. Their conversations were limited to the most basic necessities. More wood. Rain's coming. Fence needs mending. Each word was a carefully chosen stone placed with purpose. Slowly, agonizingly, her terror began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started to observe him. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle when treating a horse's injured leg. She noticed he left a small bowl of water out each evening for the desert foxes. One afternoon, hidden behind the cabin, she watched him stand perfectly still for nearly an hour, watching a hawk circle high above the valley. He was not just a brute. He was a man in communion with the wild, lonely land he inhabited. He belonged here in a way she never could. Her own transformation was almost imperceptible. The steady meals and hard physical labor began to fill out her gaunt frame. The sun, though harsh, brought a touch of color to her pale skin, making the angry crimson of her birthmark seem somehow less stark. She learned to move with more confidence, her limp becoming less pronounced as her leg strengthened. But inside she was still the marked mule of redemption's bluff, a woman purchased for a pittance. Her world shifted on a hot afternoon about 2 months after her arrival. She was weeding the garden, her back aching, and sweat stinging her eyes when she felt a presence behind her. She whirled around her heart, leaping into her throat, expecting Silas. It was not him. Standing at the edge of the garden was a man unlike any she had ever seen up close. He was Navajo, with skin the color of rich oiled copper and long black hair tied back with a simple leather cord. He was older, his face a testament to a life lived under the sun and wind, etched with lines of wisdom and humor. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a woven shirt, and carried a long staff. Agnes froze, clutching her weeding tool like a weapon. Jedediah had always spoken of the natives with fear and hatred, spinning tales of savages and thieves. The man simply smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his dark, intelligent eyes. "You are new to this place," he said. His voice was calm and melodic, the English words carefully chosen. The Silent One does not usually have company. Agnes couldn't find her voice. She could only nod her throat tight. "My name is Hastine Yazzie," he said, giving a slight bow of his head. "This has been my people's land for many generations. Cain is my neighbor. A quiet neighbor, but a good one." He looked at the plants she was tending. "Your squash is thirsty. The sun is a cruel master if you do not know its ways." He pointed with his staff to a plant with broad, silvery leaves growing near the rocks at the edge of the forest. "That is called twochin, mullein in your tongue. Its leaves can be laid over the soil to shade it and keep the water from the sky's greedy mouth." He walked over, plucked a few leaves, and showed her how to place them. He spoke to her as an equal a teacher to a student. He didn't stare at her mark. In fact, his gaze was fixed on her eyes, as if he were trying to read the story written there. This became a regular occurrence. Hastine Yazzie would appear as silently as a shadow every few days. He never came to the cabin respecting the invisible boundary of Silas's home, but would meet her by the garden or the creek. He taught her things. He showed her which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which were poison. He taught her the names of the birds that sang in the pines, and the stories the stars told in the vast, clear night sky. The holy people, the Diyin Dine, they leave their mark on all things, he told her one day, seeing her self-consciously touch her cheek. Some marks are on the stone of the canyon. Some are on the leaf of a plant. Some are on the skin of a person. It is not a sign of ugliness. It is a sign that you were touched by something powerful. It tells a story of survival. For the first time in her life, someone was reframing her curse as something else entirely. A story, a mark of strength. Hastine treated her not as a broken thing, but as a person worthy of respect and knowledge. He treated her like a woman who mattered. He was in his quiet, dignified way, treating her like a queen of this small, forgotten valley. One evening Silas returned to find Agnes not in the cabin, but sitting on a rock by the creek, weaving a small basket from yucca fibers, a skill Hastine had taught her. She was so engrossed she didn't hear him approach. He stopped watching her from a distance. The setting sun cast a golden light on her, and for the first time, he saw not the frightened girl he'd bought, but a woman at peace. Her hands, though still scarred, moved with a new-found purpose. There was a look of concentration and quiet pride on her face. When she finally looked up and saw him, she flinched, expecting disapproval. He had to know about her meetings with the Navajo man. He missed nothing in this valley. Silas simply looked at the small, intricate basket she was making. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked to the cabin. The nod was not one of approval or disapproval. It was a simple acknowledgement, an acceptance. That night, as Agnes lay on her cot, she realized the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer the oppressive silence of a prison. It was a shared silence, a quiet understanding that was beginning to grow in the space between two lonely people. And for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't afraid of the dawn. The fragile peace of the valley was shattered by the arrival of a man Agnes had hoped to never see again, Sheriff Brody from Redemption's Bluff. He rode, in one sweltering afternoon, his horse lathered, and his face grim beneath the brim of his dusty hat. Agnes was splitting firewood, a task she'd taken on herself when she saw him. Her immediate reaction was a cold dread. She thought he had come for her, that Jedediah had somehow concocted a legal claim to take her back. Silas emerged from the barn holding a large wrench. He moved to stand between Agnes and the sheriff, a silent, imposing wall of a man. His hand never went to the pistol on his hip, but his stance was a clear warning. Cain Brodie said, dismounting wearily. He nodded at Agnes. "Ma'am?" Sheriff Silas rumbled his voice low. "Long ride for a social call." "This ain't social," Brodie replied, taking off his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Jedediah Stokes was found dead this morning, back of the saloon, knife in his gut over a card game." Agnes felt a dizzying wave of relief, so powerful her knees nearly buckled. The monster from her past was gone. She looked at Silas, but his expression remained unchanged, his pale eyes fixed on the sheriff. "That's town business," Silas stated. "It is," Brodie agreed. "But his death got people talking." Old man Hemlock, the undertaker, was going through Stokes's things in that shack of his. "Found a box of letters." Brodie paused, looking directly at Silas. "Letters from your ma, Cain. From back in Ohio years ago. Talking about your little sister, Sarah." At the mention of the name, the impenetrable mask on Silas's face finally cracked. A flicker of raw, agonizing pain crossed his features, so swift Agnes would have missed it if she hadn't been watching so intently. Sheriff Brodie saw it too. He softened his tone. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Silas. I never held with what Stokes did, selling the girl like that. But now, well, it seems I understand a little more." He looked over at Agnes, at the crimson mark on her cheek. "The letters. Your ma wrote about how folks treated Sarah. Because of her birthmark. Said she had a devil's kiss right on her cheek, just like—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Agnes. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken history. The pieces of the puzzle that was Silas Cain began to fall into place in Agnes's mind. Brodie continued, speaking quietly now. "Your ma wrote that the torment drove the poor girl to walk into the Olentangy River one winter. Said you near tore the town apart, looking for the boys who bullied her. Said you left home right after and never looked back. That's why you're here, ain't it, hiding from all that?" Silas stood rigid, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The wrench in his fist looked like a toy. He was no longer a mountain of a man. He was a monument to a grief he had carried across half a country. "Get off my land, Brodie." Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm gone," the sheriff said, holding up his hands. He climbed back on his horse. "Just thought you should know. The letters clear it up. Why you did what you did. Why you paid for a girl nobody wanted." He gave Agnes a look that was for the first time full of something like respect. He didn't buy a wife, ma'am. He was settling an old debt. With a final nod, Sheriff Brodie turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a devastating revelation in his wake. Agnes stared at Silas's broad back. He hadn't moved. The story of Sarah Cain hung in the air between them, a ghost that explained everything. His silence, his sorrow, his strange and sudden act of buying her in the town square. He hadn't been looking at her that day and seeing a marked mule. He had been seeing his sister. He wasn't buying a servant. He was trying to save a ghost. He was performing a rescue mission for a girl who had died a decade ago. The weight of his pain settled on her, a shared burden. Her own suffering felt suddenly less lonely. She took a tentative step toward him. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had used his name. He flinched as if struck. Slowly he turned to face her. The stony mask was gone, and his pale blue eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He looked utterly broken. "She was 14, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer contain. She liked to press wildflowers in books. She had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. He swallowed hard. They called her names. Threw stones. Said she was cursed. I was bigger. I should have protected her. I should have. I wasn't there when she... He couldn't finish the sentence. The giant of a man, the fearsome hermit, sagged against the barn wall, the wrench falling from his grasp with a dull thud. Agnes didn't think. She acted. She walked right up to him, the man who had bought her, the man she had feared for months, and placed a gentle hand on his arm. His muscles were corded with tension. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "Her pain, it was her own. Just like mine was my own." She looked up at his tormented face. "But you saved me, Silas. You couldn't save her, but you saved me." He looked down at her, at the small, determined woman with the marked face who was offering him comfort. He saw not the ghost of his sister, but Agnes. He saw the strength she had found, the quiet dignity she possessed. He saw the basket she had woven, the thriving garden she tended, the determined set of her jaw. In that moment, the transaction that had brought them together was transformed. It was no longer a purchase. It was no longer a penance. It was the beginning of something new, something forged not from pity or guilt, but from a shared understanding of pain and a mutual unspoken promise of healing. He gave a long, shuddering sigh, a breath he seemed to have been holding for 10 long years, and for the first time since she had met him, Silas Kane nodded not in acknowledgement, but in gratitude. The sheriff's visit and the revelation of Sarah's ghost did not bring a torrent of words, but it washed away the dam of silence between them. The quiet that settled over the valley now was different, no longer a void, but a shared space of comfort and understanding. They began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small, meaningful exchanges. The sorrel mare is favouring her left foreleg, he might say, and she would reply, "I'll make a poultice." Hastine showed me which herbs to use. He started teaching her things he had never bothered to before. He showed her how to properly sight and fire the Winchester rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace, his large hands guiding her smaller ones until she could hit a tin can from 50 paces. "This land is not always peaceful," was his only explanation. He taught her how to track, to read the subtle signs left by deer rabbit and the more dangerous coyote. She learned to ride not perched in front of him, but on her own mare, a gentle buck skin he'd broken just for her. Her limp, once a source of deep shame, became an afterthought. On horseback, she was as graceful and free as anyone. Agnes in turn began to truly make the cabin a home. She had always kept it clean, but now she added touches of life. She used her weaving skills to make colourful mats for the floor and curtains for the single window. She found wild clay by the creek bed, and with Hastine's guidance, fashioned sturdy pots, and even a few small lopsided vases where she'd place the wildflowers that reminded Silas of his sister. The garden thrived under her care, producing more than enough for the two of them. She learned to pickle and preserve, filling the small root cellar with jars of vegetables. The Queen's reign, as Hastine jokingly called it, was not one of silks and jewels but of sovereignty. Agnes Purnell was the undisputed queen of this small, isolated kingdom. She had dominion over the hearth, the garden, and most importantly over herself. Her friendship with Hastine Yazzie deepened. He saw the change in her, the confidence that now shone in her eyes, eclipsing the birthmark entirely. "The Silent One's heart is waking up," Hastine observed one afternoon as they sat by the creek. "He watches you. He sees a woman, not a memory." Agnes felt a blush rise on her unmarked cheek. She had noticed it too. The way Silas's gaze would linger on her when she was laughing at one of Hastine's stories. The way he'd saved her the choicest piece of venison at dinner. The night he'd returned from a long trip to a distant trading post, not just with flour and salt, but with a small wrapped package containing 2 bars of scented lilac soap. It was a luxury so unexpected, so deeply thoughtful, that it had brought tears to her eyes. The bond between her and Silas was growing a slow and sturdy vine, twisting around the shared trellis of their past traumas. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the trust in the way he'd hold a lantern steady for her in the dark barn, and the trust in the way she'd stitch a tear in his shirt without him having to ask. It was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect. One evening, a fierce autumn storm rolled in the wind, howling through the canyon like a grieving spirit, and the rain lashing against the cabin. The thunder was so loud the floorboards vibrated. Agnes, who had always been terrified of storms, found herself calm, sitting by the fire, mending one of Silas's shirts. Silas sat across from her, carving a piece of wood. He was surprisingly deft with a small knife, his large hands shaping the block into something recognizable. He worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling fire and the raging storm outside. Finally he finished. He sanded the object with a piece of leather and held it out to her. It was a small, beautifully carved hawk, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing, from the individual feathers to the sharp, intelligent eyes. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You remind me of them. You watch everything. You learned to fly when you were meant to be caged." Agnes took the carving, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. It was a testament, a recognition of the journey she had made. He didn't see her as a victim or a project anymore. He saw her. She looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you, Silas." Their eyes met across the flickering firelight. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken emotion. He was no longer the fearsome giant, and she was no longer the ugly bride. They were just a man and a woman, 2 solitary souls who had found an unlikely sanctuary together. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, sturdy cabin, a profound and peaceful quiet had finally settled. In that quiet, a fragile, beautiful love was beginning to take root. Winter came early and hard, blanketing the valley in a thick layer of snow that muffled the world in silence. The isolation became more profound, but for Agnes and Silas, it was a peaceful confinement. Their days were spent in the quiet rhythm of survival, their evenings in the growing warmth of their shared companionship. The ghost of Sarah Kane had not vanished, but she was no longer a barrier between them. Instead, she was a gentle spirit who had, in her own tragic way, brought them together. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. A thaw in early spring turned the trails to mud, making travel possible again. It was during this muddy, uncertain season that a new storm arrived, far more dangerous than any winter blizzard. Agnes was returning from the creek, a bucket of fresh water in each hand, when she saw the rider. He was a silhouette against the grey sky, a hunched and ragged figure on a sway-backed nag. As he drew closer, a cold, familiar dread seized her. It was a man she had prayed was nothing but a bad memory, a ghost she thought had been laid to rest. It was Benjamin Stokes, Jedediah's younger, meaner brother. He was a weasel of a man with shifty eyes, and a perpetual sneer who had been run out of Redemption's Bluff years ago for cheating at cards, but who apparently had heard the news of his brother's demise, and smelled an opportunity. Silas was miles away, checking traps on the high ridges, and wasn't due back until nightfall. Agnes was alone. The lessons from Silas and Hastine kicked in. She didn't panic. She set the buckets down, her mind racing. She walked calmly back to the cabin, her hand going to the large hunting knife she now wore on her belt. She slipped inside and took the Winchester from its rack above the mantel. She checked the load, a habit Silas had drilled into her, and stood by the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands steady. Benjamin rode right up to the cabin, his eyes taking in the neat garden, the sturdy corral, the plume of smoke from the chimney. A greedy light flickered in their depths. Agnes girl. He called out, his voice oily and false. Your Uncle Benny has come to see how you're faring. Agnes pushed the cabin door open and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely but purposefully at her side. I'm no kin of yours, Benjamin, and you're not welcome here. He feigned a wounded look. Now is that any way to talk to family? I heard my poor brother passed. A tragedy. He swung down from his horse, his eyes darting around. And I heard you were taken in by the giant cane. Looks like you've landed on your feet. A nice spread. Bet he's got a bit of gold tucked away, a man who lives this far out. This is his land, Agnes said, her voice cold and even. And mine. You have no business here. Oh, but I do, he said, taking a step closer, his sneer returning. See Jedediah, he may be gone, but he left debts. And as his only living relative, I'm responsible for them. But I'm also responsible for his property. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. And he never legally signed you over. He sold you fair and square, but there's no bill of sale. According to the law, you're still a Stokes. You belong to me now. This was the moment, the culmination of her entire life's torment at the hands of the Stokes family. The old Agnes would have crumbled. The old Agnes would have believed him, would have bowed her head in defeat. But the old Agnes was gone. I belong to no one, she said, and the power in her own voice surprised her. She raised the rifle, the stock settling firmly against her shoulder. She sighted down the barrel, just as Silas had taught her, centering the bead on Benjamin's chest. I am not property. I am not a mule to be sold or inherited. I am the woman who runs this homestead, and you are a trespasser. Benjamin's sneer faltered. He saw the look in her eyes, not fear, but a cold, hard fire. This was not the broken girl from Redemption's Bluff. You wouldn't dare, he stammered, taking a step back. You ain't got the nerve. The girl you remember wouldn't have, Agnes replied, her finger tightening on the trigger. But you're not talking to her. You have 10 seconds to get on that horse and ride out of this valley. If I ever see your face again, I will not hesitate. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. She was the queen of this kingdom, and she was defending her throne. Benjamin Stokes, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He saw his own death in her steady gaze. He scrambled back onto his pathetic horse, fumbling with the reins. You'll regret this. You'll hear from my lawyer. He shrieked, but his threats were empty. He kicked his horse into a clumsy gallop and fled, disappearing over the rise he'd come from. Agnes stood there for a long time, the heavy rifle in her hands, the adrenaline slowly seeping out of her. She hadn't fired a shot, but she had won the war. She had faced the last ghost of her past and banished it herself. When Silas returned at dusk, he found her sitting on the porch steps, the rifle leaning against the wall beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. He could tell from the tracks in the mud that she'd had a visitor. He stopped in front of her. "Agnes." She looked up at him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. It was a smile he had never seen before, one of pure, unadulterated triumph. "I'm fine, Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong. "A stray dog came sniffing around. I sent him running." He looked at her, at the formidable strength that radiated from her. And he knew. He knew she had faced down her demons alone, and won. He sat down on the step beside her, his presence a comforting, solid weight. He didn't need to say he was proud. She could feel it in the quiet space between them. The storm had come and gone, and their small kingdom was safe. The confrontation with Benjamin Stokes was a final defining chapter. The last tie to her old life of shame and servitude was severed not by Silas or Haston, but by her own hand. A profound peace settled over Agnes, a quiet confidence that reshaped her from the inside out. The town of Redemption's bluff and its cruel judgments were now just a faint echo from a different lifetime. Spring bloomed in the valley with a vibrancy she had never truly appreciated before. The cottonwoods by the creek grew new pale green leaves, and the desert floor was carpeted with a riot of colorful wildflowers. Agnes found she no longer averted her gaze when she caught her reflection in the water barrel. She saw the woman staring back, the strong hands, the clear, intelligent eyes, the determined set of her jaw. The crimson mark on her cheek was still there, but it no longer defined her. It was simply a part of her, like the color of her hair or the curve of her smile. It was the map of a country she had survived. Her relationship with Silas continued its slow, steady blossoming. The unspoken affection that had grown between them began to find its voice. It started with small gestures. He would return from a day on the range with a single perfect eagle feather for her. She would make sure his coffee was just the way he liked it, hot and black, waiting for him by the fire at dawn. One evening they were sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. The silence between them was comfortable, a soft blanket. "Hastine says the stars are the campfires of the sky people," Agnes said softly. Silas looked over at her, his profile strong and handsome in the moonlight. "My ma used to say they were holes in the floor of heaven, letting the light shine through." He paused, then reached over and took her hand. His touch was warm and sure, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. "I reckon I never much cared what they were, until now. Never had anyone to watch them with." Agnes's heart swelled. She laced her fingers through his, a simple act that felt more intimate and binding than any formal vow. "I'm glad you bought me Silas." She confessed the words, tasting strange on her tongue. "I know why you did it. For her. But I'm glad it was me." He turned to face her fully, his pale blue eyes searching hers. "I did it for her." At first he admitted, his voice a low, earnest rumble. "But I kept you here for you, Agnes. I'm keeping you here because this place, I wouldn't be home without you in it." He leaned in, his movement slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She met him halfway, and his lips touched hers. The kiss wasn't fiery or desperate. It was gentle, patient, and deeply tender, a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows, quiet healing, and a love that had grown in the most unlikely of soils. It tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and redemption. Their life together continued in its simple, profound rhythm. Hastine Yazzie remained a welcome friend, his wisdom a constant guiding presence. He would often sit with them on the porch, sharing stories and watching the bond between the two people he had helped nurture. He saw Silas, the silent giant, learn to laugh, and he saw Agnes, the marked woman, carry herself with the grace and dignity of the queen she truly was. News of their strange union eventually trickled back to Redemption's Bluff, carried by the rare prospector or trapper who passed through the remote valley. The story became a local legend, the tale of the ugly bride sold for boots who had tamed the beast of a man, Silas Kane. Some said she was a witch who had enchanted him. Others whispered that he kept her as a prisoner. They were all wrong. Agnes Purnell was not a witch, nor was she a prisoner. She was a woman who had been discarded by the world, only to find her true worth in the eyes of two men who knew how to look past the surface, a giant cowboy haunted by his own ghosts, and a wise Navajo who understood that true beauty is not found on the skin, but in the resilience of the human spirit. She had not been sold, she realized. She had been found, and in the heart of the wild, lonely desert, Silas and Hastine had built not just a home, but a family. And so the story of Agnes Purnell, the woman once called the ugliest bride in town, comes to a close. Her journey reminds us that the harshest judgments of the world are often the most shallow. It shows us that scars, whether visible on our skin or hidden in our hearts, are not signs of weakness, but symbols of the battles we have survived. True value is not something that can be bought or sold. It's a quiet strength that is forged in kindness, cultivated by respect, and revealed only to those willing to see beyond the obvious. Agnes, Silas, and Hastine teach us that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we build ourselves in the most unexpected of places. If Agnes's journey from a discarded object to a queen of her own life moved you, please show your support. These are the stories we love to tell, tales of the underdog, of resilience, and of the quiet power of the human heart. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a story of true strength, and be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss another saga from the heart of the Old West. Thank you for listening.